of his wrestling. When we last left Jacob, he was serving his father-in-law Laban. He was in the middle of his 14-year term of service to Laban so that he could marry Rachel, Laban's youngest daughter. You remember last time that we looked at Jacob's life. Laban, his father-in-law, deceived him. Jacob said, Laban, I love your daughter Rachel. I want to marry her. And Laban said, that's fine. If you serve me for 7 years, you can marry Rachel. And so Jacob served Laban for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, the wedding night, Laban deceives Jacob by sending Leah, his oldest daughter, in instead. And so Jacob wakes up the next morning. He's married to Leah, not to Rachel. He goes to Laban. He says, what in the world have you done? Laban says, no problem. It's not our custom to marry the younger daughter before the older, but here's what we can do. You can serve me for 7 more years, and then you can marry Rachel too. And so 14 years, Jacob served Laban in order to be able to marry Rachel. And then 6 more years on top of that, Jacob serves Laban in order to receive some payment from his flock. And so God blesses Jacob while he's in Laban's servitude. And when Jacob leaves Laban's household, when God appears to Jacob and tells him, arise, get up, leave this place, go back to the land of your fathers, Jacob leaves a very wealthy man. He's got 2 wives. He's got 2 mistresses. He has 11 children. He has vast flocks, vast herds of animals. He's a wealthy man when he leaves Laban's house. And so Jacob's heading home. The only problem with heading home is that Jacob is heading for a reunion with Esau. He's heading for a reunion with his brother who hates him and who wants to kill him. You know, that's why Jacob left home in the first place. He took advantage of Esau. He purchased his birthright for him. Then he deceived his father Isaac, and he stole Esau's blessing. And so Esau hated Jacob. Esau wanted to kill Jacob. And so Jacob left. When Jacob left, if you remember, his mother Rebekah said, look, just go to your uncle's house, stay there for a few days, stay there for a little while. When Esau's anger cools down, I'm going to send for you, and you can come back home. Well, guess what? 20 years have gone by, and apparently Jacob hasn't heard from his mother. And so Jacob has every reason to believe that Esau still hates him, that Esau still wants to kill him. But he's got to meet Esau if he's going to go home, and so Jacob's heading home. So Jacob concocts a plan for his meeting with Esau. The first thing that Jacob does is he takes his company, he takes his servants, he takes his flocks, he takes his children, he divides everybody into 2 companies. He says this way, if when we meet Esau, and he's coming to meet us, if he attacks one company, maybe the other company can leave. And then he sends some servants on ahead just to prepare Esau, to tell him, look, Jacob's coming. The servants come back and they say, okay, Jacob, we told Esau that you're coming, and Esau is not waiting for you. He's coming to meet you, and he has 400 men with you. So now Jacob is really scared. His brother's coming, 400 men, more than enough to wipe out Jacob's flocks, his herds, his servants, everything. So Jacob comes up with another plan. He says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take some animals from my flocks and my herds. I'm going to give them as gifts to Esau to appease him. So maybe his anger will kind of be cooled down towards me. So Jacob takes his sheep, and he gets a group of sheep together. And he sends some servants with him. He says, all right, you take these animals on ahead to Esau. When you meet him, and when he says, who are you, and who are these animals, and who do they belong to, here's what you tell him. You tell him, you say, these are Jacob's animals, and they are a gift to you, and Jacob is coming after us. And so four groups Jacob separates. He separates a group of sheep, he sends them on ahead. He separates a group of goats, he sends them on ahead. He separates a group of camels, sends them on ahead. Finally, a group of donkeys, and he sends them ahead. It's a pretty good plan if you think about it. Here's Esau with 400 men, and he comes across this nice-sized herd of sheep with some servants. Who are these? Who do these sheep belong to? Well, they're yours. They're a gift from Jacob, and he's coming. A little bit further on, here's the same with a herd of goats. Who do these goats belong to? Well, they're Jacob's, but he's giving them to you as a gift, and he's coming. And then the same with camels, and then the same with donkeys. So by the time that Esau actually meets Jacob, surely he'll be in a pretty good mood. Surely he'll be swayed by Jacob's generosity, and he'll forget all about all the things that happened. At least that's Jacob's plan. So he sets the plan into motion. He sends the groups of animals on ahead. And then Jacob takes his wives and he takes his children and he sends them on ahead across the river too, along with the rest of his possessions. And there Jacob is, alone by himself as night falls. Think about Jacob for a second. Think about him there by himself, contemplating meeting his brother Esau, who hates him, who wants to kill him as far as he knows after 20 years. Think about how afraid he must have been. Think about all the anxiety. Think about the stress. Think about all the things that had to be going through Jacob's mind there as he sat there by himself, awaiting the daybreak so that he could meet his brother. But Jacob wasn't alone for long. This brings us to the passage that we read this morning, and the Bible says that a man wrestled with Jacob until daybreak. All of a sudden, he's by himself, and then there's a man there in front of him, and the two of them wrestle. This man confronts Jacob, and they begin to wrestle, and they wrestle until daybreak. Apparently, neither man could gain the upper hand in the match because the match just continued on, and it lasted all the way until day was breaking. When the man who wrestled with Jacob saw that he couldn't overpower him, when he saw that he wasn't gaining the upper hand, the Bible says that he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh, and he dislocated. He dislocated Jacob's hip just by touching it. If you know anything about wrestling, you know that at this point Jacob is out of commission. Jacob has no more hope of winning the wrestling match. Now I'm talking about wrestling, not talking about wrestling. I'm not talking about some of that stuff that you guys watch on Thursday nights or whatever night it comes on. I'm talking about actual wrestling. Two men actually really going at it, trying to overpower one another, trying to subdue one another. Real wrestling. See, I'm the second of four brothers, and so I know a little bit about wrestling. There was always a wrestling match going on around our house. In fact, that was our evening entertainment sometimes. My dad would pair us off. My older brother and I, my two younger brothers, he'd sit us back to back in the living room floor, and he'd ring the bell, and we'd wrestle. So always a wrestling match going on in our house. I got a little older in high school. All the athletes lifted weights during PE, and sometimes our weightlifting coach didn't feel like going in the weight room, and so his entertainment, probably similar to my dad, I guess, just on a bigger scale, was he would circle everybody up, he'd get the wrestling mats out, and he'd call two guys out, and you'd wrestle. And nobody wanted to lose those wrestling matches, so those were pretty intense. A little further on in high school, my youngest brother was actually a member of the wrestling team, and so I've been to a lot of wrestling meets, watched a lot of those, was the guinea pig for a lot of my little brother's wrestling holds and all that kind of stuff. You know, real wrestling is a pretty physical spectacle. It involves two people just really trying to subdue one another, and so when this man touches his thigh, he dislocates his hip. Jacob is done. He has no more offensive power. All he can do is just hang on at this point, and that's what he does. The man dislocates Jacob's thigh, and he tells him, he says, "Let me go, the dawn is breaking." And even though Jacob knows that he has no hope of winning the match, even though he knows that he can no longer overpower his opponent, he can't subdue him, he just holds on and he refuses to let go. He says, "No, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me." So then the man says, "Well, what's your name?" And Jacob answers him, "My name's Jacob." He says, "No, your name's not Jacob anymore. From now on, your name's going to be Israel, because you have striven with God and with man, and you have prevailed." And so the man blesses Jacob. I think by this time, Jacob realized that he wasn't dealing with a mere man anymore. That's why he asked him to bless him. So the man blesses Jacob, and then apparently he's gone, because the next thing we see Jacob crossing over the river, going on towards the groups of people who were going to meet his brother Esau, and he's limping. He's limping on his dislocated hip, but he's moving. Jacob renamed the place where the wrestling match took place. He named it Peniel, and that means the face of God, because he said, "I've seen God face to face, and I've survived. My life has been preserved." So let's ask a couple of questions about Jacob's experience here. A couple of questions that I think will help us grasp the full significance of what was going on. First question that we ask is, was Jacob really physically wrestling? Because if you read some commentators, if you read some scholars, they'll say, you know, this wasn't actually physical wrestling. This was Jacob wrestling with God in prayer. This is not meant to be taken literally. And before Jacob sent his wives and before he sent his children on ahead of him across the river, he did pray. He did kneel down and he did entreat God, and he said, "Look, God, my brother wants to kill me, and you've promised to preserve my life, and you've promised to protect me, and you can't let that happen." So Jacob did pray. But I would disagree that this was a wrestling with God in prayer and not a physical wrestling. I believe Jacob was really wrestling. Two reasons why, and they're really not very complicated. The first is that the Hebrew word for wrestling that's used in this account has as its root the word for dust. It's only used here. And it gives us the picture of two people down in the dust, down in the dirt, fighting with one another, struggling with one another, trying to overpower one another. That's the first reason. Then the second reason is, while I've had some seasons in my life where I really feel like I was wrestling with God in prayer, where that's how I would describe my praying, I've never received any physical injury from praying. Jacob had a physical injury. The Bible says when he finally crossed over the river and left, he was limping on his hip because it was dislocated. So I think Jacob was really physically wrestling. I don't think this was any kind of wrestling with God in prayer. I think he was really wrestling with somebody, physically wrestling. Well, if that's the case, that brings us to the second question. Well, then, who in the world was Jacob wrestling? The individual that Jacob wrestled against is described in three different ways in the Bible. In verse 24, he is described as a man. A man wrestled with Jacob until daybreak. Later in verse 30, Jacob describes him as God. He says, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been preserved. The book of Hosea, there are a couple of verses about this account. Hosea chapter 12, verse 4, the individual that Jacob wrestled with is described as an angel. So we have a man, we have God, we have an angel. Who was it that Jacob was wrestling against? The way that most scholars reconcile these three separate titles is by identifying the person that Jacob wrestled with as God in human form. A pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ, if you want to think of it like that. Pre-incarnate simply means Jesus Christ appearing before he was born as a baby in the manger. A lot of people think it's the same messenger of God who visited with Abraham in Genesis chapter 18, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. Jacob wrestling with God in human form. That's the second question. And then the third question, why in the world did God choose to interact with Jacob like this? This is God in human form. This is the God of the universe. God can approach Jacob any way that he wants to. God can deal with Jacob any way that he wants to. Why in the world does God choose to physically wrestle with Jacob? Why does he choose to get into a physical confrontation with Jacob? I believe God's purpose in wrestling Jacob was to bring him to the end of himself, to bring him to the end of his self-reliance, and to bring him to a place where he had to depend totally on God, where he had to trust totally in God, where he had to ask God, would you please give me a blessing? See, all of his life, Jacob had relied on his own cunning. All of his life, Jacob relied on his own shrewd planning. All of his life, he relied on using his wits to get what he had. All of his life. Got his brother to sell him his birthright by taking advantage of him while he was hungry. Got his father to give him the blessing of the firstborn by deceiving him. His father-in-law Laban got the upper hand the first time they went around, but by the time Jacob left, Jacob had most of Laban's wealth. He had the best of his flocks. He had most of the wealth of his household when he left. Jacob was a schemer and he was good at it. And all of his life he relied on his own wits. He relied on his own cunning. He relied on his own ability. God wanted to break him of that. God wanted to bring Jacob to the place where he could not continue on his own ability any longer. Where he'd come to the end of everything that he could do, where he had to ask God, where he had to cling to God and say, no, I'm not going to let you go until you give me what only you can give me. I believe that's the place that God wanted Jacob to be. Jacob was desperate enough at the end of this wrestling match to come to the place of insisting on what he needed the most. Not even protection from his brother, not even safety, not even the preservation of his life, just a blessing from God. Just that God would do what only God could do. That's where God wanted Jacob. That's what God wrestled with Jacob for. To get him to the end of himself, to bring him to a place where he was dependent on God to give him what only he could give him. And the fourth and final question, what was the result of God's wrestling with Jacob? I think God used this wrestling with Jacob to change Jacob's character, first of all. To teach him that there was an end to what he could do by himself. God used the wrestling to change Jacob's character, but then he changed Jacob's name to reflect the change in his character. You notice God said to Jacob, what is your name? You think God didn't know Jacob's name? I think God just wanted Jacob to hear himself say it. My name is Jacob. Remember what his name meant? Heel catcher, supplanter, the one who uses deceit and trickery to trip another person so he can take their place. I think God just wanted to hear him say it. That's who I am, God. I'm the heel catcher. I'm the supplanter. I'm the one who takes other people's place through deceit. That's me. I think God just wanted to hear him say it. But then God changed his name. He says, from now on, your name will be Israel, because you have striven with God and have prevailed. People debate the exact meaning of the name Israel, but it is a title of victory from the root meaning to persevere. And some people have translated it as a title that means something like prince or ruler with God. It basically is a title that reflects a worthiness to govern a nation that's earned through struggle. That's who Jacob became through his wrestling with God. He went from being somebody who used deceit and trickery to take another person's place, to supplant another person, to being somebody who, through his struggle, came to a place where he was able to rule with God. A prince of God, a ruler with God. Somebody who has striven with God and has persevered. That was the result of God's wrestling with Jacob. This was a significant event in Jacob's life, to say the least. Personally, I believe that this was the turning point of Jacob's life. I think this was the place where he really came to experience God as he really was. I think this was the place in all the events of Jacob's life that he really came to a place where he realized it's not about my own ability anymore. It's not about what I can do for myself anymore. It is about me trusting God and receiving his blessings, receiving what only he can give. I think this is where Jacob learned that, right here. Now, there will be some setbacks a little bit further on in his life. There will be some times when he forgot, when he needed to be reminded. But I think this is a place where God transformed Jacob's character. He changed him from the heel grabber to the one who was a prince with God, who persevered. So finally, I think there's some core truth from this passage that we can kind of pull out and apply to our lives this morning. Here's the first truth. It's simply this: God is committed to work in the lives of his children. God is committed to work in the lives of his children. You know, God is the one who initiated the struggle with Jacob. Did you notice that? The Bible says a man wrestled with Jacob until daybreak. Not Jacob wrestled with a man, but a man wrestled with Jacob. God is the one who initiated the confrontation with Jacob. God was not content to leave Jacob where he was. I think Jacob was content to stay in the place where he was. Jacob had this scheme even for his meeting with Esau. He had this plan even for his meeting with Esau. He said, I know how to make this right. I know how to make Esau forget about what I've done. I know how to make him accept me and receive me. He had a scheme for everything, a plan for everything. I think Jacob was content to remain as he was, who he was. But God was not content to leave him there. And so God appears to Jacob. So God confronts Jacob. So God wrestles with Jacob until he brings him to a point where he's broken and where he's depending on God to bless him. God is committed to work in the lives of his children. The same is true for us, I think. I think on an intellectual level, all of us sitting here this morning, most of us sitting here this morning would probably affirm, I want God to work in my life. I want God to sand off the rough edges. I want God to prune away the wild branches. I want God to take away the things that don't belong. And I want him to make me more like his son, into something that's going to be honoring and pleasing to him. I think most of us who are children of God, who have a relationship with God, would affirm that. I think we'd say, yes, that's what I want. But we don't initiate that process very often, do we? We say that we want God to change us. We say that we want God to transform us, but mostly we're just content to stay like we are. As long as I'm comfortable, as long as I'm happy, as long as I have things, as long as everything's going okay, that's fine. I want God to change me, but then I don't want God to change me. And so guess what God has to do? God has to initiate the confrontation with us. God has to meet us somewhere and wrestle with us. God has to break us. He has to get us to a point where we are totally dependent on him, but you know what? He's committed to do that. This is a beautiful thing. I don't want us to miss this truth. God is committed to work in the lives of his children. And this is about God's faithfulness, and it's not about our worthiness. You see, this wasn't about Jacob's worthiness, and we've gone over that before. Jacob didn't do anything to earn God's commitment to him. Jacob didn't do anything to earn God's faithfulness to him. This was about God's faithfulness, and it's the same for us too. When God confronts us, when God decides, I'm not going to leave you there, I'm going I'm going to confront you. I'm going to wrestle with you. I'm going to bring you to the end of yourself. It's about God's faithfulness. It's not about our worthiness. It's not because we're good enough. In fact, God has to do that because we don't come to Him on our own, because we don't turn to Him on our own, because we don't give up on our own. He has to make us. But God is committed to work in the lives of His children. See, God makes a promise through His Word. Every person that He begins the work in at the moment of salvation, He's going to bring that work to completion. He's going to do it because He's faithful. If that means confronting us, if that means wrestling with us, if that means breaking us, if that means bringing us to the end of ourselves, He'll do it. God is committed to work in the lives of His children because He is faithful. This was all God in Jacob's life. And you know what? Anytime that God works in my life to produce the character of His Son, it's all God. It's not me. I'd rather stay comfortable. I'd rather stay safe. I'd rather stay whole. I'd rather stay with two good legs, just like Jacob would have rather stayed without the limp. But you know what? God is not content to leave me in that place. God will do what it takes to work in my life to produce the character of His Son. God is faithful and committed to work in the lives of His children. And we ought to be thankful for that. Second truth is this: God wants our self-reliance. He wants to take our self-reliance from us and give us in exchange dependence on Him. That's what this struggle with Jacob was all about. It was about exchange. God wanted Jacob to exchange his self-reliance for dependence on God. God wanted Jacob to exchange this mindset of I can do it my own way. I can figure out a way to make people do what I want them to do. I can make people give me what I want from them. God needed him to do away with all that. And God needed him to come to a place where he said, look, if I don't receive a blessing from God, I have nothing. If God doesn't do it, I've got nothing. That's where God wanted Jacob. The same is true for us. I believe the struggles in our lives are about bringing us to a place where we realize that we just don't have it. You know, we have a lot of blessings, we have a lot of good things, but we are totally dependent on God for everything. And until God brings us to a place where we acknowledge that, He can't do anything in us. He can't do anything with us. So the second truth is just this: God wants us to give Him our self-reliance, and in exchange He will give us dependence on Him. And that brings us to the third and final truth. Only when we come to the end of ourselves can we truly receive God's blessings. I believe that's true. God made these promises to Jacob a long time ago in his life. When he first left home, if you remember that dream that he had with the ladder, the bottom on earth, the top going up to heaven. God said, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to prosper you. I'm going to make your descendants a great nation. I'm going to stay with you until I bring you back to this place. God made this promise to Jacob a long time ago. But I don't think Jacob ever truly received that as the blessing that it was until this point in his life, right here, when he was broken before God. When he had nothing left to give, no abilities left, no power left, no strength left. That's where God needed Jacob to be so he could receive the blessing. It's not that God won't bless us if we're self-reliant. It's just that we won't receive God's blessings for what they really are. And that's something that we need to hear especially because we have so much. You know, I really believe that God is the one who provides everything that I have. Everything. Everything. Even the things that I think I go out and work for, even the things I think that I earn, I think all that comes from God. We have so much monetarily. We don't recognize that God is the one who gives it to us. But when we get to a place, if we ever get to a place where we have nothing, imagine what that would be like. Some of you can't even imagine what it would be like to have nothing, monetarily speaking. But imagine that you got to that place where you're scraping together change for a meal, where you're putting gas in your car $3 or $4 at a time. Imagine that you came to that place where you had nothing. Don't you think you would recognize every dollar as a gift from God? Don't you think you would recognize everything that you receive from that point on as provision from God's hand? I bet you would. Because self-reliance is gone. Because all that I earned this, I made this, I bought this, it's gone. Don't you think in the morning you might say, God, if you'll just provide what I need to make it through today, I'll thank you. I bet you would. Same way with our health. You know, when we're in that season in life where we're young, where we're healthy, where we're strong, we take it for granted. We say, I did this, I exercise, I eat healthy. I'm the reason why I have this health. And we just get out of bed in the morning and we go, we don't think anything about it. What happens when you get to that point in life where the doctor says, well, you've got 6 months, maybe 9 months if you're lucky? What happens then? But every morning that you get out of bed, you say, wow, this is a blessing from God. The ability to roll over, the ability to put my feet on the floor, to stand up, to go see my family, to see my children, my grandchildren, to breathe the air in, to feel the sun on my face. It's a gift from God. I bet that your perspective changes when you realize, hey, I can't do anything to extend my life. I'm at the mercy of God. You know, the same is true of salvation. And this is the most tragic place where we overlook the blessing of God. Because we think we're pretty good people. We think, well, I live right, I try to be a good citizen, I work hard, I pay my taxes, take care of my family, I'm a good person. I don't really need God's forgiveness. I'll throw God a bone every once in a while. I'll come to church, I'll put some money in the offering plate, maybe I'll say a prayer, maybe I'll read my Bible. I don't really need God then. Remember what it was like to be spiritually destitute before God, to feel the weight of your own sin. Remember what it was like, and maybe you've never been at that place, to think about the fact that I'm headed for eternity in hell and there's nothing I can do about it. No amount of good that I can do, even when I make up my mind to do right. There's still those thoughts in my mind. There's still those words that escape. There's still those attitudes that I have. I just can't do it. Remember that sense of hopelessness where you realize I'm heading for an eternity in hell and there's nothing I can do about it. At that point, guess what? Mercy from God is a blessing. Forgiveness is a blessing. The idea that Jesus would take my place, would take my sin upon himself, that's a blessing I can't even begin to imagine or describe. But it's only when I get to that place where I come to the end of myself do I realize it for what it is. That's true for us in life. It's true with our money. It's true with our health. It's true in every part of our lives. Until we come to the end of ourselves and recognize our total dependence on God, we cannot appreciate his blessings for what they really are. God needed to break Jacob. He needed him to be at a place where he could not do it anymore. Where all he could say was, I will not let you go unless you bless me. That's where God needed Jacob. That's why he wrestled with him. That's why he wrestles with us. So I thought about that for this morning. And I just thought I'd ask you, what is it that you're holding on to this morning? What is it that you refuse to let go? What is it that God needs to confront you about? What is it maybe that God's been wrestling with you about? What is it that God's saying, if you'll just give up, if you just give up, I'll bless you? What is it that you're hanging on to? What's that struggle? You know, the longer we hang on and the harder we fight, then the worse God has to break us in order for us to rely on him. I think Jacob got off easy personally. A dislocated hip, yeah, he may have limped on it for the rest of his life, and it was a reminder for the rest of his life, but I think it could have been a lot worse. How long are you going to hang on? How long am I going to hang on to those things that God is trying to wrench from my grasp? Things I don't need, that he just wants to take and replace with a blessing. How long am I going to hang on to those things? The longer I hang on and the harder I fight, the worse God's going to have to break me, I think, to bring me to a place where I just depend on him totally. So what is it that you're struggling with? What is it that you're fighting with? What is it that you won't let go? Let go of whatever it is that you're wrestling with and cling to God. Don't give up. Don't just lay down, but cling to God instead of what you're holding on to and say, God, all right, I'm going to hang on to you until you bless me. I'll let go of this. You can have it, but I'm going to hang on to you, and I will not let go until you bless me. That's what we need to do. So during the invitation time, here's what I want you to do. I just want you to spend some time asking God, okay, God, maybe you know, maybe you don't need to ask him, but if you don't know, maybe you just need to ask, God, what is it that I'm clinging to? What is it that you want from me? What is it that I'm not letting go of? I want to encourage you to make a little progress down the path of releasing your grip on whatever that is and transferring it to God and clinging to Him and saying, God, I'm going to hang on to you, and I'm not going to let go of you until you bless me. If you need to come to the altar and pray, if you need to talk with somebody about your relationship with God, I'll be happy to do that, but don't miss the chance